All right, good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Jim Hovland. I'm the mayor of Edina. This is the 5th year that our Human Rights and Relations Commission has sponsored this local Days of Remembrance in co-celebration with the National Days of Remembrance. And frankly, I think that from a community standpoint, we're the community in the metro area that has had the most sustainability with regard to this very, very important thing. So here we are on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, and we think it's extraordinarily important that we keep these stories alive, that people continue to recognize what happened to different groups of people in our society, our global society. So today we're going to have Ellen Kennedy from World Without Genocide. Dr. Ellen Kennedy is going to talk a little bit about the Armenian genocide. And you can see just recently in the paper that the Turks are really having a difficult time dealing with this. They've even criticized the Pope. So we'll be in with the Pope today in terms of being subject to Turkish criticism. But we're going to talk a little bit about, and Ellen will talk in detail about the Armenian genocide and the effect that it's had on people ever since over this last 100 years. The refusal of the Turkish government to recognize what took place. With respect to the Holocaust, it's been an extraordinarily important event to recognize in our community over the last 5 years. And today, now I'm going to get her name right. I'm going to look at it here. We're going to have Dora Zeidenweber with us, and she's going to come about 1:30. She's 91 years old. She's partially blind, very, very sharp. But she's going to talk a little bit about her story from Poland, what took place in her town and her family, and then also her family experience at Auschwitz. And then we're going to have a play about upstanders, and it will touch on both those topics, both the Armenian genocide and the genocide that we all know so much about and have been so affected by all these years since World War II. So I'm going to introduce Jan Seidman, who's the chair of the Human Rights and Relations Commission, and she's going to introduce Ellen Kennedy. And please give Jan and our Human Rights and Relations Commission folks, would you raise your hands, please? Yeah, please give them a round of applause for putting this together.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. In 2011, an Edina resident sent a letter to the city asking if we would put on an event to recognize and honor the survivors and the victims of the Holocaust. In 2012, the city said, annually we will put on an event to remember these people. In 2013, the city of Minnesota, or the state of Minnesota, decided that April would be Genocide Awareness Week in April. And so now together with this event, we combine the Holocaust event and the Genocide Awareness events together. 5 years ago, we had Fred Barron, who was here speaking as a Holocaust survivor. Unfortunately, he has passed away. Last year, we had Fred Amram that came and speak. Was anyone here last year for Fred Amram's speech? A few. So Fred Amram last year talked about why is it important to remember? Why is it important to tell these stories? We're sitting here, it doesn't impact me, my family, the community. Why have this event? And Fred was very clear about showing in Germany the beginning of injustices before the Holocaust took place. He showed people scrubbing the floors and no one stopping them from doing it. He saw the Jews scrubbing the floors. Have anyone seen Woman in Gold? Recently, Helen Mirren, excellent movie. And in that scene was what Fred Amram told us about, that people were scrubbing the floors with lye at that time, and no one did anything to stop it, nothing. The other thing we're talking about today is, yes, not close enough? Thank you. The other one we're talking about is the Armenian, right here. Today is the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. I'd just like to say a quote from Father Thaddeus of St. Sahag Armenian Church in St. Paul. And he states, "History repeats itself, And if you don't know the history of what happened 100 years ago, or even 10 years ago, it's hard to deal with problems that the world is facing today. It's important to condemn the violence. It's important to seek justice for the survivors and mourners. And it's important to remember and to celebrate the achievements and accomplishments that survivors and their children have made throughout these many years. In speaking to several survivors this past week, it's so ironic to hear several of us had not heard about the Armenian genocide. It's not something we remember being taught in school, yet it happened from 1915 to 1923. It came, it went, and in 1934, in the early 30s, the Holocaust started. We didn't learn our lesson. We didn't understand the injustices that occurred then that were occurring in the 1930s and 40s. And so we get together right now to understand that it may not impact us right here, but it impacts our families, our communities around the world, and it's not just about forgetting, it's remembering and taking a stand as the things that we can do to help other cultures, races, and people around the world. I have another quote from someone who's here. Her name is Dora Zeidenweber. And Dora says, she believes in speaking about her experiences and has educated many young people and teachers around the world. If there is a lesson to be learned from the Holocaust, Dora believes if you do nothing and ignore what is happening when others are being persecuted, you are no different than those who have perpetrated the crime. And that's one of the reasons that we're here. First up will be Dr. Ellen Kennedy. Dr. Ellen Kennedy is the founder and executive director of World Without Genocide, a human rights organization headquartered at William Mitchell College of Law. The organization educates the public about genocides and advocates for policy and laws at local, state, and national levels to protect innocent people, prevent mass atrocities, prosecute perpetrators, and remember those who have been affected by genocide. She's received many awards for her work, including Outstanding Citizen from the Anne Frank Center in New York and Woman of Achievement from DKG, an International Women's Educator Society. Ellen is also a member of the Edina Human Rights and Relations Commission. Thank you, Ellen, for being here and talking about the genocide and the Holocaust.
Thanks to all of you for sharing your time this afternoon. I want to talk about denial. This is a momentous and tragic month, Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. As you have heard, we have remembered this month the 70th anniversary of the Holocaust. Next Friday is the 100th anniversary of the genocide of the Armenians. There are millions of people around the world who deny that these catastrophes ever occurred. Why does this denial matter? In 1939, when Hitler was planning the annihilation of all of Europe's Jews, he was asked how he thought he'd be able to accomplish the goal of exterminating 9 million people across an entire continent. Wouldn't the world take notice and stand up to stop him? Hitler said, "Who today remembers the Armenians?" And Hitler's reply is why this issue of denial matters. Beginning in the late 1890s, and with sporadic and horrific massacres that continued in full force from 1915 through 1923, the government of the Ottoman Empire, in what today we refer to as Turkey, annihilated 1.5 million Christian Armenians. Yet this genocide is not taught in our schools. Did any of you study it in school? No. Although the largest Armenian diaspora community is here in the United States, most Americans truly know little or nothing about it. This was the first large-scale government-organized genocide of the 20th century. The United States was fully aware of this effort to completely annihilate a people. But President Woodrow Wilson's government did nothing. There were no major tribunals after that genocide, unlike the Nuremberg tribunals of the worst of the Nazi perpetrators after the Holocaust. There have been no blockbuster Academy Award-winning films like Schindler's List about the Holocaust. There are no Armenian genocide museums in the United States, and only one in Armenia. There are Holocaust museums, memorials, and educational centers in 27 countries, and in 23 states, and in Washington, D.C. And every year, on January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, there is a formal ceremony in the U.S. Congress with resolutions and statements by nearly every senator and representative on the Hill. On April 24th, the memorialization date of the Armenian genocide, there is silence. Yet both of these tragedies, one nearly invisible to most Americans, and the other with vast efforts at public education, face the same challenge, and that is the challenge of denial. The Turkish government, as you've heard, denies that what happened was genocide. Several years ago, 126 internationally renowned Holocaust and genocide scholars, including Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel, affirmed in this New York Times ad, and I quote, "The incontestable historical fact of the Armenian genocide." And these scholars urged Western democracies to officially recognize it. So let's look at what the recognition has officially been. It has been officially recognized in 21 countries, 43 US states, including ours, and by leading scholars worldwide. It has not been officially recognized in the US, and it certainly has not been officially recognized by the government of Turkey. 2 weeks ago, 15 US senators, including Republican Senator Marco Rubio and Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren, signed a bipartisan letter urging President Obama to attend the main memorial event that will happen in Yerevan, Armenia on April 24th. And I quote from this letter, "To send a powerful message that the United States recognizes the magnitude and the full meaning of the Armenian genocide." The senators went on to write, and I quote, "While the US Congress has a long history of support for victims and for the memory of the Armenian genocide, our administration has not formally recognized the atrocities that were perpetrated against the Armenians as genocide." When he was running for president, then Senator Obama said in a 2008 campaign statement, and again I quote, "The Armenian genocide is not an allegation. It is not a personal opinion. It is not a point of view, but it is a widely documented fact supported by an overwhelming body of historical evidence. The facts are undeniable. As president," he said, "I will recognize the Armenian genocide." He has not yet taken action out of fear of reprisals from the Turkish government. These are the 15 signatures of US senators that accompanied this letter. Whose names do you not see? Whose names? Whose names? We don't see Senators Franken or Klobuchar. That is correct. We ask that before you leave today, you stop at the table with the blue tablecloth and you sign letters to Senator Franken and to Senator Klobuchar, asking them to support this important request to President Obama. We will deliver these letters to their local offices, to Senator Klobuchar's office at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to Senator Franken's office at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. And Christy, raise your hand. Christy is organizing a delegation. If you would like to join us, please let Christy know. Arguments denying the Armenian genocide take many forms, including the numbers are inflated. Violence was perpetrated on both sides. The violence was justified because it happened in the context of the war. And the Armenians died from starvation, not from any brutality enacted by the Ottoman government. Despite years of protest, the Turkish government refuses to acknowledge this genocide. It puts them in the same camp as Germany and Hitler, as Cambodia and Pol Pot, and other perpetrators. Referring both to denial of the Holocaust and denial of the Armenian genocide, Hilda Chobian, president of the European Armenian Federation, explained, and I quote, "The hydra of denial, like the snake you see here, is a tumor on freedom of expression." And I think her image of this snake, the mythological nine-headed hydra, captures the thought very well. Elie Wiesel has repeatedly called Turkey's campaign to cover up the Armenian genocide a double killing, because it also strives to kill the memories of the original atrocities. And what about the Holocaust? How can people deny the truth of the Holocaust? In this cartoon, Iranian denier Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is confronted by the reality of the tattooed arms of Auschwitz survivors. In 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander of the Armed Forces, was with American troops at the liberation of one of the concentration camps. Eisenhower anticipated that someday an attempt would be made to characterize the Nazi crimes as propaganda. He took steps against it. He wrote the following about his visit to a concentration camp, and I quote from his memoir. "I saw my first horror camp," as he called it, Ohrdruf, near the town of Gotha, Germany. "I have never been able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard of every shred of decency." He wrote the following to General Marshall. "The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me sick. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever in future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Eisenhower ordered all possible photographs to be taken at Gotha, and for the German people from the surrounding villages to be ushered through the camp. You see them standing here, viewing the bodies. But he did more than that. He also made those Germans, the civilians, assist in helping to bury the dead. After seeing this camp, the mayor of Gotha hanged himself. Holocaust denial takes many forms. Nazi Germany's final solution policy aimed only at deporting Jews. It included no policy to exterminate them. Nazi authorities did not use extermination and gas chambers for mass murder. And the actual numbers of Jews killed was an order of magnitude less than the historically accepted figure of 6 million. Most Holocaust deniers, like the Ku Klux Klan, claim that the Holocaust is a hoax and a Jewish conspiracy to advance the interest of Jews at the expense of other peoples. And for this reason, we refer to it as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Holocaust denial is widely found on social media. I found this on Facebook last week. In some Arab eyes, the story is somewhat different. There is disbelief in the very happening of the Holocaust, not as hatred of Jews, which is embedded in the denial in the West that I just reviewed. But for some Arabs, it's more a protest at the portrayal of the Jews as victims, as ultimate victims, and to some Arabs' perception that this underrates the perception of Palestinian victimhood. And they deny Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, which they feel gains legitimacy from the Holocaust. But how can people deny the documents, the bodies, the eyewitness testimonies, the survivors, the facts? We know opinion selects facts. We choose what to believe. Despite all manner of verifiability, deniers remain absolutely convinced of their own version of the truth. Denial has a profound impact on everyone concerned. Denial harms the victims and their survivors. Around the world, victims of genocide ask first for recognition of the crime that has been committed against them. It is as essential to healing as closing an open wound. Without such healing, scars harden into hatred that can affect both the body and the mind. We are here today to recognize the survivor. Imagine her pain if the world did not acknowledge her experience. Instead, we give dignity, legitimacy, and honor to Dora Zeidenweiber today. Denial also harms the perpetrators and their successors. Studies by genocide scholars prove that the single best predictors of future genocides is denial of a past genocide and impunity, no prosecution for its perpetrators. Governments that deny that they perpetrated mass atrocities are more likely to commit genocide again. Denial means that individuals have no reason not to do evil again and again. Denial harms the rescuers, people who risked their lives and the lives of their loved ones to save innocent people are left with a deep sense of loss that their future did not change, despite their best efforts to prevent the worst of atrocity crimes. And further, it denies what they attempted to do, to stand up and to speak out. I want to show a short excerpt from a film titled The Soap Myth. This excerpt is a film of an off-Broadway play that dealt with a story about efforts during the Holocaust to make soap out of the bodies of Jews who were victims. The short excerpt, it's about 5 minutes, is a denier. This excerpt addresses the profoundly difficult issues of who has the right to write history, and even more importantly, who has the right to decide what constitutes history and what constitutes its truth. How much information must be provided for verifiable confirmation? This is not a documentary film. This is a fictional portrayal of a reporter who has interviewed a Holocaust denier. And the reporter goes to hear the denier speak at a college So Scott, wherever you are, this is the moment to start the film.
I had heard that Brenda would be speaking at a symposium in
Louder, Scott.
Pennsylvania at a small college there. And I felt the urge to go and see
Still
for myself
louder?
what such a thing would be like.
Thank you.
Louder.
Thank you for having me. Several years ago, the Russians announced that they had found, no doubt in the archives in the KGB, index cards of all the prisoners who'd been in Auschwitz. That announcement sent a shudder around the world's Jewish community. Why? I will tell you why. Because of the inexhaustible supply of Auschwitz survivors. First, the battleship Auschwitz set sail, soon followed by the cruise ship Holocaust, which has taken to the oceans this massive luxury cruise ship with its crew of thousands. This cruise ship Holocaust, which has terminals established now in virtually every capital of the world, disguised as Holocaust memorial museums, the one in Washington, D.C. alone costing $146 million to build. Your money. And when these Auschwitz index cards come out, when the Russians make these records public, we are talking about comprehensive and exact lists of all the people who ever passed through the gates at Auschwitz. What will they do, all the Jews claiming to be survivors? Well, it's already started, hasn't it? Suddenly folks aren't claiming to be Auschwitz survivors anymore. Take Elie Wiesel. He has always been uncertain about whether it was Auschwitz he'd been in or Dachau or Buchenwald. There's a photograph with prisoners in a barracks in Buchenwald, and he points and says, yes, that's me. But when it turns out that photograph was in Auschwitz, he says, oh, yes, I meant Auschwitz. I mean, you'd think he'd remember. What they claim cannot be taken seriously. Jews have had a very hard time of it, yes, and I am sympathetic, and I'm sure you all are sympathetic. But our sympathy must not get in the way of the truth. So, yes, if you want to go and have a tattoo put on your arm, which a lot of them do, if you want to perpetrate a hoax, if you want to stand up and say, I was there, I suffered, I survived, and claim you were in Auschwitz even though you weren't, then my advice to you is you'd better make sure, because that hoax is about to collapse on top of you. And it is not anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic to point this out. The truth is not anti-Semitic. Many Jews are not part of this hoax, but the ones who are have lied to hundreds of millions of people. Yes, individual crimes did happen, ghastly crimes. Crimes against one person are unacceptable. Crimes against thousands are 1,000 times more unacceptable. And I denounce them, and we should all denounce them. And I will say tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, because that is supported by historical evidence. But millions, hundreds of thousands not sufficient? Must it be millions? Must it be 6 million or 8 million or 12 million? Must the Jews be greedy even in this? I was speaking in Louisiana, and there was a handful of Jewish infiltrators who'd come along to cause trouble, and they interrupted me and behaved in a thoroughly obnoxious manner. And I said to their ringleader, I don't know what I've done to have you shrieking at me. It's not my fault that you are hated, that you Jews, your whole people are hated, that you've been hated for 5,000 years. Hated so much that you've been hounded from country to country, from pogrom to purge, from purge back to pogrom. So why do you never ask yourselves why? Why don't you look in the mirror and ask, why are we so hated? Why is it the rest of humanity tries to put us through the meat grinder? And he went berserk. Are you trying to say that we are responsible for the Holocaust ourselves? And I said, yes. The short answer, I have to say, is yes. If you had behaved differently, maybe the Germans wouldn't have gone around doing whatever it was they did to you. Nor would the Romans, or the Iranians, or the Russians, or the Estonians, or all the other countries that have tried to exterminate you. So why haven't you ever asked yourself that question? Of course they have no answer. Instead, they just want to make life unbearable for people like me, people who are concerned. I mean, really, I am only trying to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
As I stood in the back, the crowd into this anti-Semitic frenzy.
Thank you. So what do we do about denial? I have seen this excerpt many times. As a Jew, as a human being, this is so deeply disturbing. I scarcely know what to do with myself. In some places, denial is against the law. Switzerland, Slovakia, Cyprus, and Greece make it a crime to deny the Armenian genocide. Holocaust denial is illegal in 14 European countries and in Europe. Some of these European countries, like Germany and Austria, take these laws very seriously, and they vigilantly prosecute both speech and behavior having any reference to Nazis and to Nazism. Others, like Lithuania and Romania, despite laws on the books, enforce the laws sporadically. And then there is a third group of European countries that have a higher value on free speech. And in these countries, the UK, Ireland, and the Scandinavian countries, freedom of speech and freedom of the press are vehemently upheld, even to the detriment sometimes of other rights. The European Union has not prohibited Holocaust denial outright for all 28 member nations, but there is a maximum jail term of 3 years, optionally available to all member nations of the EU for, quote, denying or grossly trivializing crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And at least 15 people to date have been given prison terms and fines in various European countries for Holocaust denial. Supporters of these denial laws say that they are more necessary than ever as the number of Holocaust survivors and eyewitnesses is dwindling, and as these events are receding into history. And as a direct result, Holocaust denial is growing, and the views are becoming, tragically, more mainstream. People who want to outlaw and punish denial even argue to expand the laws cross-nationally through the internet to prosecute sites like that Facebook posting so that social media cannot promote this hatred. But some people say that a government that has the power to punish lies also has the power to punish truth. In the United States, denial is protected by free speech. As a result, neo-Nazi parties are completely legal, and their anti-Semitic messages, anti-Armenian messages, any message of hate, these are all protected by the Constitution. The only limitation on free speech, on such speech, according to the Supreme Court, is any speech that calls for immediate violence. Many scholars feel that the work of Holocaust deniers should be protected by a universal right to free speech, because the hallmark of a true democracy, they argue, is not just the protection of speech that one agrees with, but the protection of speech that is the most hateful and the most despicable. They assert that education is more effective than legislation in combating denial, and that laws against denial make martyrs out of those who are imprisoned for their violations. Even countries that do not specifically criminalize denial of the Holocaust do indeed prosecute individuals for hate speech. But the dividing line between those two, Holocaust denial and hate speech, is murky. The US Supreme Court has heard 6 hate speech cases between 1949 and 2011, and each one of them was decided in favor of free speech. In the United States, Voltaire's words are the words that shape our approach. I do not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So where does that leave us with this issue of denial? The best defense against denial is more truthful speech. And that's the purpose of these annual events in Edina. That's the purpose of the bill that was signed at the state of Minnesota in 2013. Every April, throughout our state is Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. There are only 4 states in the country so far that have passed this law, and we are working to make it many more. I want all of you today to speak up and to speak out. And one simple step to do that is to sign those letters to Senators Klobuchar and Franken, urging President Obama to give official recognition and official memorialization to the genocide of the Armenians. We must remember, this is increasingly important as time goes on. The last remaining survivor of the Armenian genocide in the US is gone. Holocaust survivors are with us in ever fewer numbers. I'm wearing a lot of pins today, a lot of them. This one is what you see large on the screen. It says Zachor, the Hebrew word remember. This is a forget-me-not, special symbol for the Armenian genocide. And with many thanks to Leroy and Cynthia Erickson from the Armenian Cultural Organization of Minnesota, who provided them for our group today. We must remember, and we will remember, and we hope that we all will remember. Thank you.
Do you want it?
On? Yes. Sounds like it is now. Okay.
Very close to you.
Okay. While Dora and Susan are getting ready, just wanted to say that I met Dora about a year ago when she was presenting at the citywide Yom HaShoah event. Since I met Dora, I also got to know her daughter, Roseanne, who's in the back of the room. There you go. I've heard lots about Dora's grandson, who takes her to Illinois and does lots of presentations lately. So it's been a joy to meet Dora and your family, and I'm glad that you're here today. Got it. I'll tell you a bit about Dora. Dora was born in Radom, Poland, in January 24th, 1924. Her father was a community leader and a member of the executive committee of Poland's Zionist Labor Party. In 1941, Dora and her family were forced into the Polish ghetto. Dora was then transported to Auschwitz in July 1944. She remained there until January 1945, when she and other inmates were evacuated and forced to march to Bergen-Belsen. Dora was liberated at the Bergen-Belsen camp by British troops on April 15, 1945, and thank God she was reunited with her husband, her father, and brother several months later. Dora and her husband Jules settled in Minnesota in 1950, and I understand since then, Dora has been telling her story. Dora believes in speaking about her experiences and has educated many young people, teachers, and individuals along the way. Along with Dora, we have Susan Weinberg. Susan Weinberg is an artist, writer, and genealogist. Okay. Her artwork has taken her on a journey from family history to the Holocaust and is focused upon linking story and imagery. Most recently, Susan has completed a series of artwork on identity and legacy based on interviews with elders at Shalom Home, and is currently developing artwork on the topic of memory. That seems to go as we get older, yes. Susan paints at her studio in the California building. You can learn more about her work at studio409art.com. And if not, you can always talk to Susan at the end of the event. She'll be outside. In addition, Dora, during this time, had written a book with her father called Sky Tinged Red. Thank you. And that book will also be available outside to buy. Dora will be talking a bit about that today. So I thank you both for coming. Is it Scott?
I'm not sure.
Is it? Let's try.
Scott.
Let's try and see if it's on.
Can you hear? It's working? Okay, he turned it on remotely. Fabulous. Okay, well, thank you, Jan. Dora, we first got to know each other when I was doing a series of artwork on the Jews, the former community of the Jewish community in Rodom, Poland. And I learned that you were from Rodom, as was my grandfather. And in 2011, we went back to Rodom together. And I exhibited my artwork, and you shared photographs. And the photographs were from before the war and during the time of the ghetto. And they had an interesting story as to how you still had them.
Actually, I didn't do anything about that. But on the night in 1942, in August of 1942, when the Jews of Rodom were assembled two nights in a day, there was a selection, which was a name for deportation. The selection meant that people were passing in front of German selectors, usually Gestapo and SS men, and they decided who would go away, be sent away, and who would stay. My brother, as we walked out of our, can't really call it home, but in the ghetto where we lived for almost 2 years, this was, the conditions in the ghetto were very difficult. But for some reason, when my brother walked out, he came back quickly. He went back quickly and grabbed a handful of pictures. He didn't have time to look at what the pictures were about, but whether he had an idea that he would never come back, I don't know. He took that handful of pictures and the bundle that we're allowed to take, and he kept them in his shoes the whole remaining time, which is more than 2.5 years, in the different camps that he went through. And so that's how we preserved some kind of a remembrance that we were able to pass on to our children and grandchildren. It was like living it, looking at those pictures.
Yeah. And we have one of my favorite pictures from that of you and your father on the screen. And I think what I like about it is you can see it's been folded in quarters to fit into the shoe.
The one that was folded
Yeah.
4 times, yeah, because that was a pretty big picture.
Yeah.
I have the original, of course, and so it was folded to fit into his shoe. That was taken in 1938 when my father and I, prior to my going to summer camp, he went to a resort in the south of Poland, and I went with him for about a week before I went to camp.
Okay. Well, we're going to share some of your photos and also some of the paintings on your stories that I've done as we tell your story. What struck me about the photos was it reminded me that you had a life before the war.
Absolutely, we all had lives before the war.
We focus on the Holocaust and we sometimes
Well,
forget that.
you saw Radom, you've been there with me. And it's interesting that we found out when we went and wandered through the streets, and you told me where your grandfather lived. Mm-hmm. And it was the same building where my grandmother lived.
Actually, my grandfather's brother, was at the same address
And,
85 years ago. We found it
And we found out that they were both engaged in some trade or business. Mm-hmm. And your comment was, they may even had coffee together because their stores were nearby.
So 85 years later.
So 85 years later, there we go.
Yeah, we saw them in the business.
And we look at it and really have a feeling that we'd been there before, right?
Yeah. What was your life like before the war?
Well, I think one could say that it was the life of an average middle-class 15-year-old that went to school every day. On September 1st, it so happened, was the end of our summer vacation. And the following week, we were going back to school. And what we were worried about, we didn't have to worry about clothes. We didn't have to buy clothes because we wore uniforms. And the uniforms were the same next year as they were the year before. But that was essentially it. We lived. You saw the building where we lived. It was a nice building. It wasn't the same one that my grandmother lived in.
Yeah.
Remember, Talguta 51. Yeah, it was a very nice, ordinary life.
What was Radom like? What was the city?
Radom is not a very large city. For American standards, it was a small city of about 100,000 population, but for European standards, it's probably a medium-sized city. I remember from my geography that Radom was the 11th largest city in Poland. So you can imagine how there were 10 larger cities, the largest, of course, being Warsaw, the capital.
You were telling me when you were in school, this is an answer to Ellen's question, that you did learn about the Armenian Holocaust or the genocide.
Yeah, maybe
They didn't call it that then.
when I was in 9th grade or 10th, my last year in school was the 10th grade. We learned about it in a very brief way in history. It's only 24 years later after it happened. But first of all, we didn't know, there was no word for genocide yet. That was created later. But the reasoning was, let me interject that things next door in Germany were already getting very hot for Jews. But that wasn't in Poland, certainly not yet. And so there was among the Jewish population already in Radom and elsewhere was very tense about what was going in Germany. It was after the Kristallnacht of 1938 when there was a huge pogrom in the cities in Germany. But it would never come to what happened in Turkey, because the reasoning was Germany was not Turkey. Turkey was a collection of wild tribes, and next door Germany was one of the most sophisticated, much more intellectually and culturally developed. They wouldn't be killing people.
I found that fascinating, that perspective from in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So now also in Radom, I think your father was an accountant,
Yes.
and you had two brothers, one who survived to the war. Okay. Anything, you also had a lot of other family in Radom.
What?
You had a lot of other extended family in Radom.
Oh, our family goes back many generations. You know, like everywhere else, in the center cities, in the cities that were situated in the center of the country, usually had a pretty stable. There were many wars in Europe, including 2 world wars in the 20th century. They were constant. So there were a lot of exchanges of populations, but that was mostly in the border areas. So Radom didn't have much of a mix of different people, of different races or religions or nationalities. So it was a pretty stable kind of life. That is not to say that we didn't feel that as Jews we were certainly different and often treated differently. But it wasn't terrible. And nothing terrible was to be expected.
Until September 1st, 1939. Tell us a little bit about what happened that day and the ensuing
that day was, that night, the radio told us, German panzer divisions, meaning the motorized divisions, crossed the border into Poland and were advancing very fast. Poland was in no way prepared to deal with an invasion of that mode. And the first we knew, it was a beautiful sunny day. So the first we knew what happened were the planes that were flying over. Radom is about 60 miles south of Warsaw. And so on the way to Warsaw, the planes were flying over. What I remember that immediately that first day, the men were all called down into there was an orchard in the back of our building, and they started digging trenches, a zigzag trench to hide in when the planes were flying over and dropping bombs. Of course, they were dropping bombs, but we never were able to finish those because a week later, the divisions, the mechanized divisions, rolled right through Radom, and some of them stayed and some went on towards Warsaw. So it was a real hot war for 8 days.
Okay, and then what happened to the Jewish community?
Well, the Jewish community, just as the general community, those few days after the war started, and maybe for some weeks after, It affected everybody. There wasn't yet much different between the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community. We all had to submit radios, guns. People who had them, we didn't. And orders were being issued by posting billboards. And everything was punishable by very severe means. But later, as weeks passed by, we were getting ration cards and new passes. That's when we were separated from the rest of the Polish population. Our ration cards had the little pieces that designated whatever this was for, had Stars of David on them, and the passes were blue rather than white, and were stamped with the word Jew. So we were there. This was the start of the division of the two different populations.
When did you get armbands?
That was a little later. At the end of 1940, we did get the armbands, which were white, about 4 inches wide, and had the blue Star of David. In typical German fashion, every armband had to be the same. So nobody could make their own, and an industry came around to make those and sell them.
Yeah.
Everybody had to buy one.
When did they create the ghetto?
In 1941, we were then transferred to the ghetto. It was a section generally of a very, very bad housing. One would call it slum, but it wasn't quite as bad as some slums, but it was very crowded. People were, whole families were sometimes crowded into one large room, or at least into very small pieces of, and in many cases there was no indoor plumbing either. So that resulted in a great deal of suffering for most people. The worst thing that happened from the very beginning, actually, was that stores and factories and establishments of any kind were closed down. To make a living became impossible for Jews. Jews could not operate anything. In time, the Germans requisitioned all the factories and installed German administrators. In some cases where there were important industries, and there were some, although Radom was pretty small, it had a number of important industries. And therefore, those that required special skills, in some of them, the previous owners were employed. And in fact, one of those industries were tanneries, leather tanning establishments. And since one of them, my father had him as a client, my father continued in the beginning working in that factory.
Now, in 1942...
1942 was what I mentioned before, when my brother got the picture out. In two nights and one day, 20,000 Jews of Radom were packed into boxcars. Many were killed in the process, especially those who didn't move very fast, children, mothers with children. Basically, who was left over were young people that were able to work, most of them men, but some women, including me.
But in 1942, your father was taken also, and that was
Well, that was not at the, I
Different than-
didn't stop there. There was something else that happened to my
Okay.
father, which was, I think, we didn't know it in advance, but at the time it was obvious what had happened. On April 28th, 1942, a large deportation was in August. This was in April. At night, what woke me up, and I think it was 4 o'clock in the morning, was machine gun fire in the ghetto. That in itself would not be unusual, but the volume of it and the speed of the shooting was very much different than had happened before. And then almost simultaneously, there was a knock on the door, and a voice in German said, orders to open the door. My brother, who was 19, was the first one at the door, opened it, and there was a German officer who had us, all of us, the 4 of us, identify ourselves, and then told my father to get dressed and come with him. He stood there in the little hallway and had a view of the bedroom where we all were. My father did. He was at the time indisposed. He had an inflammation of the sciatic nerve and was walking, using a cane to walk. He asked the German officer if he could take the cane, and he was given permission, and then they walked out. And the shooting was going on. And then when 6 o'clock was the end of the curfew hour. At 6, my brother finally managed to interrupt our very loud silence. We could not speak to each other. We didn't know what to say. And he announced to us, my mother and me, that he was going to go out and to find out what had happened. When he came back 2 hours later, he said that 200 men had been arrested that night. And they were largely people who were active in the community, leaders of the community, including my father. But it wasn't, and about half of them were shot on the spot, execution style, and the other 100 were taken to Gestapo headquarters. He was not able, nobody was able to tell him which man was shot and which man was at Gestapo headquarters. So he had to go to the grounds of the hospital to view those who were those who were dead, the dead bodies of those who were laid out there. And he did not find him among the dead bodies. So he came back and he reported to us that those men, the 100 that were not shot, but that our father was among them. One really didn't know for sure which was better, to be at Gestapo headquarters or at dead.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you know where he had been taken at that point?
No, we didn't. The next night, they were, after the administration of the ghetto was notified that to bring out food. I guess they took a kettle of soup, which was the usual diet in the ghetto. And they came back when the the Jewish man who took the food there, when he came back, he said that the men were pretty badly beaten up. The next night, they were put in boxcars and shipped out. At that time, we didn't know where they were taken. But you know, this was now 2.5 years after the beginning of the trial that was the occupation, the German occupation, the treatment of the Jews. There were rumors, and we had heard the name Auschwitz and that it was a terrible place, but nobody really had any idea what it was. From bad to worse, we didn't know that. But a few weeks later, telegrams started arriving, dated Auschwitz, that the men were dying. They were notifying the families that their loved one died of natural causes. Now, as we later found out, it was partially true. The men were not being gassed. There was no gassing yet in Auschwitz. They were actually dying from the conditions in which they lived and the things that they were done to.
But you didn't hear on your father.
We did not hear about my father. We did not get a telegram from him about him.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears to your mother. We've talked about a lot of your stories, and you were with your mother during the whole
Yes.
war. So the forced labor camp, you went to Auschwitz, and then later Bergen-Belsen with her, with a few death marches thrown in between.
Which one? The first one?
We'll get to it. Yeah, two of them.
I was on.
And most of the stories that involve your mother involve her saving your life. So
Yeah, well, it wasn't easy. It was a terrible, terrible world. To try to really describe it would be impossible. Actually, and I read this way later after the war, that a Jewish historian who was in a camp was telling another one who survived. The historian did not. But he said to his co-prisoner, if ever any of us would survive this ordeal, the unbelieving world, we wouldn't be able to convince that it really happened. And you know, we didn't believe it either. Stage by stage, we could not believe that in this century, the 20th, that in this world that we lived in Europe, that people were being exterminated. The word is ominous. You don't exterminate people. And I found out that after you try to tell people, if you could even find the words, you try not to scare people by telling about these things, about what humanity is really capable of, no matter how civilized they think themselves to be and they are thought of. Apparently there is some kind of an uncivilized beast in almost anybody and everybody.
So speaking of extermination, I'm going to ask you to tell a story about when you and your mother went into Auschwitz.
When we came to
When
Auschwitz?
you came to Auschwitz, yep.
Well, we had to go through a selection. But this was very bewildering, what was going on here. One amazing thing that was apparent when we entered Auschwitz and got off the boxcars was this incredibly bad odor that I remembered from being a child when, you know, in these days, people were still, when you pull the thing from chickens.
Yeah, you pluck them.
Yeah,
pluck the
the
feathers.
rest of the chickens are cleaned by holding over a fire, and then the terrible
flesh.
smell
Yeah.
of burning flesh. That's what it smelled of. But to even imagine that this what was done to people, it was horrifying, absolutely horrifying. But until then, this was the first encounter with it. You had to come to Auschwitz to really experience it.
So what happened once you and
So,
your mother arrived?
when we got off the trains and we were herded, there were about 500 women from Radom. I thought we were all young women. By then, all the older women, and many young women, those of course who had children, went with their children to their death. So mostly single women between the ages of, I don't know exactly, I was 18, so I was still in pretty good shape. And my mother too, but she was in her 40s. And 40s was already beyond the allowed age to be alive at this point. But she was really very good looking. And what was noticeable when we had to undress completely nude, and our hair was shaved off, which, as we looked at each other, was kind of funny. You actually look pretty funny with your hair shaved when you're a woman. So I shouldn't say we, I didn't pay much attention to what was going on. But suddenly this officer walked in, and it was a high-ranking officer in dress uniform. He had a hat, this military cap on, that was covering his forehead and over his eyes, so I couldn't really see his face. He was wearing white gloves and had a riding stick under his arm. And when he came in, the other Germans issued orders to line up single file. And pretty soon it was noticed there were women. In this case, it was the right side. The stereotype is that right side was good and left side wasn't. In our case, right side turned out to be the bad one, and the left side was good, because young women were sent to the left side. And here, a small group of women about my mother's age were suddenly being singled out. And there was a lot of commotion, because on the left side were their daughters, who suddenly saw themselves being separated from their mothers and suspected that this was something bad. I was behind my mother. And as we were nearing the place where we would come in front of this officer, my mother reached over and moved me to in front of her. And we both went to the same left side. Much later, it came to me that this happened, and I asked my mother why she did this, and she said, I didn't want you to follow me in case I was sent to the right side, because she saw what was going on, where I didn't.
So she was paying attention and very alert.
That
to what
was
happening.
if you've heard a name, that was Dr. Mengele, who was the one who was usually conducting those selections.
So
And then we went to camp.
yeah, to camp. So you were there for 6 months in Auschwitz.
Yes.
And your father was there.
Yes, my father was there. It turned out that he was one of 3 who survived from that 100 that originally came. Among them even actually an uncle of mine, his brothers, who died. And again, he died of natural causes because he had what's that called? Dysentery. Yeah. So the conditions were such that people didn't survive. My father, because he knew a number of languages, probably 6, was singled out and put into a group of workers that registered incoming transports. Yeah, the Germans were very, very, very well organized, and everybody who stayed in camp, who was brought into camp to live, at least temporarily, of course, had a number tattooed on their forearm and was duly registered. So my father was one of those registrars, and as a result, he was able to observe what Auschwitz was like and what was going on there. And after the war ended, he wrote it all down.
And we'll come to that in a second.
Okay.
So you were in Auschwitz for 6 months, and then you went on a death march.
Yes.
Towards
The interesting thing was that when we arrived in Auschwitz, when our camp, we were in camps before we came to Auschwitz. We were in forced labor camps, and the last one, they were the ones that I was in, my mother and I, were all in Radom because of the industry that was there. Part of the time I worked in a gun factory, and other times I worked whatever work there was, I was assigned to. The proportion of women after the deportations was maybe 1 to 5. So there were not that many women. So at the time when we were sent out from Radom to Auschwitz was a time when the Soviet forces were already practically at the gate of Warsaw. Nothing happened. They stayed there for 6 months, but the smaller camps like Radom were by then sent to Auschwitz, which was still going full steam. I don't know the exact numbers, but probably close to 1 million Jewish people were killed at Auschwitz in the gas chambers and crematoria there.
So it was towards the end of the war when you went from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. And and we say death march. What was the death? What's a death march?
Why was it?
Tell us. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it was marching for 3 days, exhausted as we were, with little food, if any, and some people, especially young men, trying to run. There was a great death toll. Every time anybody sat down at the side of the road, because they couldn't walk for that much anymore, got the bullet in the head. But they knew that that's what was going to happen. And one time I almost wished I could do it because I couldn't walk anymore. In the summer, when we marched in the summer it was from Radom before we went to Auschwitz, on the way to Auschwitz. It was terrible, but it was not as bad as the march from Auschwitz in the direction of, those were not short distances. We walked for 3 days, and then we were put into the boxcars for the rest of the journey. But the one so in the summer, as I recall, we were walking on a road that it was just before harvest. So the grain I think it was wheat, it certainly wasn't corn, was very high. And I watched how young men were running into that field, and the machine guns went off and they were falling. And you know, I thought maybe if they stay and fall down, maybe they fell down and are pretending that they've been hit. But then the German soldiers ran into the field and made sure that they were dead. One of my uncles could not walk anymore. He was just too exhausted. Not just exhausted, but I think he was ill as well. And every so often, a German with a horse-drawn buggy would come by and offer rides to those who couldn't walk anymore. So eventually, my uncle decided to do it. And as soon as the buggy was full, they went around the corner into the woods, and you heard the shots. They were all killed. So that's why they were called death marches.
Okay,
There was a lot of death.
Yeah.
And especially in the winter, when we left Auschwitz, it was January, late in January, and we didn't have adequate clothes. Our shoes, I still suffer in the winter from frost-bitten toes.
Yeah, from that.
You feel you know, I get into bed and my footsie, my tootsies get warm and they start hurting.
Yeah, it's a reminder. Well, I'm going to switch gears and we're going to move you. The war ended. You were liberated in Bergen-Belsen.
And I was half dead, or more than half.
But you were with your mother at the time. You reunited with your father, your husband, your brother.
Well, took some time.
Took some time, I know.
We were all separated. My father, we didn't know where he was, where he went from Auschwitz. He was sent away from Auschwitz before we left. Sometime in October, and we didn't leave until the following January. So we didn't know where he was taken. My brother, who came to Auschwitz in the same train that we did, but the man went on. The train left with the man. Only the women were left in Auschwitz. So we didn't know where any of them were. But eventually, as months went by, there were efforts made by various agencies, particularly the United Nations agencies, and some individual religious people like the Jewish chaplains took on traveling from displaced camp to another. We were by then housed in, mostly they were military installations, of the German military installations, and they were called displaced persons camps. The chaplains compiled lists of people in those camps and circulated them, so that it took time, and it was very cumbersome and very difficult, because my brother and my husband were liberated by American troops in the very south, in the southern Alps of Germany, whereas my mother and I were liberated by British troops in the north of Germany, hundreds of miles away apart.
But eventually you all reunited.
And my father, as it turned out, was liberated by Russian troops. Mm-hmm. So it took many months to find each other.
And you were still in Germany for some years, going to school, and you and your husband.
Yeah, we stayed in Germany for lack of a place to emigrate to. It took time for all those to sort it all out. The only thing that was readily available to us was return to our own country.
Yeah, which nobody wanted.
And very few people opted to return to our
People were
their
murdered.
country. Yeah.
I want to shift to the book a little bit. So,
Okay.
So your mother died 3 years after the war, which I know was very difficult.
At age 50.
Yeah, your father and brother had come to Minnesota, and eventually you and Jules joined them.
Yes.
Just very briefly, what was your life like in the United States after the
Busy.
war? Busy. Huh?
Busy. Coming to a new country, a new language, establishing yourself, and and getting any younger.
Yeah.
So
And you had 2 children to raise.
So it was difficult and promising and busy, mainly busy. We needed to catch up, the young people, my husband, my brother, and myself, had to catch up with some sort of education. And no matter where you were going to go, eventually, to settle, you still had to get the education where you could, and that was in Germany.
So when you came to
So when we came here, actually, it was hard.
Yeah.
So my parents, who were not in good health at that point, and they were both, my mother was 50 when she died. My father later died at age 62, so obviously their health was very, very much affected.
So that was 1960, and after your father's death,
Yeah, he died in 1960
Yeah.
here. My mother died in Germany. We found, my brother and I were going through his papers and possessions, and we found 3 copies of a manuscript typed on an ancient Yiddish language typewriter. The Yiddish language, like Hebrew, is written from right to left. It's the same alphabet as Hebrew. And so we, although my brother and I knew Yiddish, we didn't really, it was a little, it was hard. It wasn't the language that we communicated in, but we knew it. We could communicate in, but slower. So reading it was slow. It turned out, just by reading a little bit, the beginning of it, which was his introduction, it was a memoir, or I called it chronicle, because it really isn't only about him. It is a chronicle of what Auschwitz was like in those 2.5 years that he spent in the part of Auschwitz that was called Birkenau, which was, there was an Auschwitz and a Birkenau, and they were about 2 miles apart. And Birkenau was where the gas chambers and crematoria were, and that's where he spent the 2.5 years, practically from the time when they were building all those, the buildings that housed the crematoria and gas chambers. And he wrote about people he knew, Germans that he observed, how various groups of people and individuals, how they behaved, how this affected them. And it's very revealing. Everybody should know what happens under circumstances such as this. He wrote it in Yiddish because initially he felt that it was for Jewish audiences only. And that was the universal language that most Jews at these times still spoke. This is not the case now. In 2 generations, practically all of it has disappeared. And that's why when we realized what it was, we thought it would be a good idea to translate it into English. But being busy, raising families, there was little time. And when I brought it to my brother, asking him to, maybe the 2 of us, and my husband too, to do some translating about it, my brother's answer was, "You do it." Because I wasn't supposed to be as busy as they, because I was only raising 2 children, but they were working. They didn't do anything to come home and help with doing the dishes or cooking dinner or anything like that. But this was the answer. He just didn't feel like doing it. So in about 1980, around
20 years later.
Huh?
So 20 years after you discovered it.
Yeah, 20 years later, these conversations went on. I decided, since all I get is you do it, I'll do it. So I started working on it, and I did it. Except that at the end of it, I realized that it wasn't really the end. And I couldn't find any more typed pages. So I decided in 2000, maybe it was 2007, to send the manuscript and all the other writings that my father had to the place in Israel called Yad Vashem, which is the place in Jerusalem that's the memorial to the Holocaust. And as I was packing everything up to send it there, I looked one last time through his papers. And that's when I found the rest of the manuscript. Actually, I found the entire manuscript in handwritten form. He did not complete it on a typewriter, but he had the whole manuscript. And so I set out to finish it then.
But you had a little challenge this time around. You had a little challenge this time around.
I had some problems this time around, because in the meantime, I lost a good part of my vision.
So here's your book.
Oh,
Copy of your book.
oh, okay, that's the book.
That is the book. Dora
That's
will
the book.
have it outside. She is selling it. I've read the book. It's an amazing story. I don't think it's
An amazing collection of stories. It's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
stories about people and happenings, not just about what happened to him. He had it, well, there were some very bad times when things were very iffy for him as well. He was still subject to being a prisoner of Auschwitz, Birkenau. But that was fine. It came finally to fruition after all these years, but it would have happened without the participation of my children and grandchildren, who were active participants because, of course, of my handicap, but also because it was so important to them. They just really committed themselves to this transfer of memory that would would be transferred from generation to generation. Hopefully, it will make a little difference.
And Dora, if you were to leave us with one thing, all of us sitting here, from all of your experiences, what lessons would you like us to have learned?
for all the years here in the United States, the interesting part that a lot of, we are called survivors. I prefer to call us witnesses. All of us had a need to talk, to make the world know, to let the world know what really happened. You know, if you think about it, and I know, I learned it from my father, when people suffer, when people, even other handicaps, they like to see that somebody cares, that somebody is interested. And when nobody wants to listen, it's very depressing, and you feel very abandoned. That's what happened to us. Nobody wanted to hear our stories. And it seemed like nobody really cared. It probably wasn't that. It possibly was that people thought that it would be, and my father even says the same in his introduction. He thought so too, that people wouldn't want to bring up these terrible memories because it hurt too much. But the opposite is really true. We had a need to tell because we felt that the world has to know. It has to be prevented again. This was a lesson that is never to be forgotten. The thing is the possibility that what human beings are really capable of.
You know, you think about the Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923, and then the Holocaust comes 10 years later.
That's right.
You would have thought if people knew about the Armenian genocide enough.
No. Didn't I tell you? Didn't you hear me say what we thought of it? That was something extraordinary because you had the image of these Turks on horses killing people. And that wasn't where we lived.
Right. And the Holocaust was how many years after you had that reaction? A couple years?
10 years,
Yeah.
less than 10 years at that time. So I guess we're here also to say, one, we know what happens. We know it might happen or will happen again. We're here not just to forget, but to remember what happened to this.
Yeah, but don't forget that even now, there are people who deny that what I just told you ever happened. No, Auschwitz, never mind the smell, they never mentioned that, but it was a huge bakery. The fire, that's why this book is titled Sky Tinged Red. That was from the bakery, not from people being burned. And there are many who believe it.
Well, we should let you move on
Thank
to the
you
next.
both very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Susan, thank you for helping out.
Always love it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for arranging.
Amazing. Thank you. Dora said that we have one more part. We have a play now called Upstanders, Armenians Saving Jews, which will be about 20, 30 minutes. After that, anyone who wants to ask Dora a question, she will be outside by the table. And if you talk loud enough, she'll answer your question. But she is ready and willing to answer questions. She knew she didn't have time now, so come her way and talk to her. So anyone who wants more, again, we're having another play coming up. It'll be about 20, 30-minute play now.
Will this taping be available?
It will be on channel 16.
Channel
16.
16.
16.
How do we find out when it'll be?
I believe the mayor. They're right. One on that. And then we'll take one.
You want to? Oh, that's for me. How do you want these allocated?
Doug over there, and Henry over there. I believe she's up there, in the lobby.
Stick it in your pocket.
Ready when you are.
We are, is this on? Yes. We are so pleased to present this very short Reader's Theater play this afternoon called Upstanders, Saving Armenians and Jews. The participants you see are students, fellows, staff, and board members of World Without Genocide, and I'm going to do brief introductions, starting on your far right. Professor Emeritus Douglas Heidenreich. Doug is a former dean of William Mitchell College of Law, a member of the board of directors at World Without Genocide, and a longtime actor with Landmark Center's Trial Reenactment Series, which brings to the stage trials that were held at Landmark Center when it was the federal courts building. Noted Twin Cities judges, legal practitioners, and academics often trade their legal robes for costumes to bring the courts to life. Next is Professor Emerita Phoebe Hagen. Phoebe was the first female tenured professor at William Mitchell. She too is a board member of World Without Genocide. Her legal interests lie in the intersection of law and end-of-life issues, with a focus on morality and ethics. She and Doug participated in reading a different version of this play last year, and we thank them for returning. Nicholas Webb. Nick is a third-year law student at Mitchell and also a board member. He's a Benjamin B. Ferencz Fellow in Human Rights and Law at World Without Genocide, where he is focused on human rights violations in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He recently published an article on this topic in the Bench and Bar magazine, sent to all of the lawyers in the state of Minnesota Bar Association. He helped to pass a Bar Association decision on this issue and has prepared legislation on it for the Minnesota State Legislature. Next is Elizabeth Meske. Liz also is a third-year Mitchell student and a Ferencz Fellow in Human Rights and Law. Her work addresses the persecution of religious and ethnic minorities in Bhutan and Burma. She has given several talks on this topic. She studied at Bar-Ilan University in Israel last summer during the war on a program co-sponsored by World Without Genocide. Next, Guled Ibrahim. Guled is a second-year Mitchell student, also a Ferencz Fellow. He is working on materials to support United States ratification of the International Criminal Court. He also has prepared website materials on Somalia and on other countries for educators and for students. Christine Nickerson. Christy is the Program and Operations Director at World Without Genocide. She is also a Carl Wilkins Fellow, one of 12 people in the U.S. in a program for citizen advocacy of human rights. Christy just received a Rotary Peace Fellowship for Master's Studies at Uppsala University in Sweden in Peace and Conflict Resolution. She will leave on August 14th for a 2-year degree program in Sweden. She and Nick Webb were both part of a study program in Burma this past January, teaching English and human rights to Buddhist monks. Last, Henry Twiss. Henry is a sophomore at Southwest High School in Minneapolis, where he is in the International Baccalaureate program. He participated in our Summer Institute for High School and College Students last summer, which looked at the legacy of the Rwandan genocide. He plans to return this summer for the topic Religions and Genocide. His grandfather, a world-renowned scholar on that topic, will be one of the featured presenters. Henry is very active in speech and debate at his school and will be captain of the debate team next year. All of these people are what we call upstanders. They all have a remarkable commitment, as I just outlined, to human rights issues, locally and globally. And they also range in age from 16 down there to 83 over there. And I hope that you will find the stories of the people they will share to be truly inspirational.
I don't need this, I got this. Genocide. Geno means people, side means killing. Genocide means the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It means killing innocent people based only on who they are. This crime has occurred on every continent and against people nearly of all national, ethnic, racial, and religious groups.
Millions of American Indians were killed during the colonization and expansion of the United States.
More than 700,000 Aborigines were killed during the colonization of Australia.
Approximately 10 million Congolese were killed in the 1880s and 1890s.
Nearly 8,000 Herero were killed in Namibia in 1904.
More than 1.5 million Armenians were killed in present-day Turkey from 1915 to 1923.
6 million Jews and 5 million others were killed during the Holocaust in Europe in the 1940s.
The word genocide didn't exist until it was coined to describe the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis. Now we had a name for the atrocities, but the violence still continued around the world.
After the Holocaust, genocides occurred in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Central America.
2 million people were killed in a genocide in Cambodia in the 1970s.
200,000 people were killed in a genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s.
200,000 people were killed in a genocide in Bosnia in the 1990s.
Nearly 1 million people were killed in a genocide in Rwanda in 1994.
And 6 million people have been killed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in a genocide that began in 1996 and continues today.
And 400,000 people have been killed in Darfur in a genocide that began in 2003 and continues today.
From the genocide of the Armenians, 1915, to Darfur today, 2015, a century of genocide.
During World War I, the Ottoman government in the area we call Turkey today systematically and brutally killed more than 1.5 million Armenians based only on who they were, a group that had been discriminated against for years based on their Christian religion, their identity, and their culture. Today, the Turkish government denies that this genocide ever happened. This impunity led directly to the tragedy of the Holocaust. In 1939, when Hitler's supporters asked how he thought he could get away with killing all the Jews, he replied, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" We know that genocide will end if we punish the perpetrators. It will end if we keep innocent people from being targeted. It will end if we prevent hate from flourishing. Never again, promised after the Holocaust, has meant over and over again. It must mean never.
We will tell the stories of upstanders, men and women, young and old, of various nationalities, ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds, who dare to intervene when they encounter genocide. We will share stories of people who tried to save Armenians, and of Christian Armenians, 30 years after the genocide of their own people, who reached out to save Jews during the Holocaust. These upstanders intervened at different stages and with different tactics, some to educate, others to rescue people being targeted, some to provide humanitarian aid, and still others to take political action. What's an upstander? An upstander is the person who stands up, speaks out, and refuses to let injustice go unchecked. These people were all ordinary in most ways. They became extraordinary when they stood up against genocide.
My name is Raphael Lemkin. I was born in Poland. I read about the atrocity of the Armenians genocide when I was a young boy. I was horrified that nothing was done to bring the perpetrators to justice because the concept of state sovereignty protected them. I couldn't understand how an entire people could be destroyed while the world did nothing. After World War I, as Hitler became to power in Germany, I tried to raise the alarm to warn people that he could exterminate an entire group of people based on who they were. I fled to America. My family stayed behind in Poland, convinced that they would be safe. 49 members of my family died in the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz during the Holocaust. There was still no name for what happened and no punishment to prevent it. I became obsessed with creating the law that would make it a crime to exterminate a people. Winston Churchill said that Nazis' massacre was a crime without a name. So I named it. After I became up with a new name, genocide, we needed law to prevent and punish genocide. I wrote a genocide convention, and it was approved by the United Nations in 1948. We have the word, we have the laws, and now we prosecute people for heinous crime.
I'm known as the angel of the battlefield for my work during the U.S. Civil War to provide care to wounded soldiers. My name is Clara Barton. The International Committee of the Red Cross was founded in Europe in 1863. I believed in their mission, and I started a movement for recognition by the United States government. In 1878, I met with President Rutherford B. Hayes, but he wasn't interested. He said that the U.S. would never again face a calamity like the Civil War. I finally succeeded with President Chester Arthur, convincing him that an American Red Cross could respond to crises other than war, such as earthquakes, forest fires, and hurricanes. I became president of the new American branch of the Red Cross that began in 1881. A few years later, I heard about the terrible massacres of the Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire. Nearly 300,000 people were slaughtered in what are called the Hamidian massacres. Nearly 50,000 children were orphaned. I had to do something. So I organized the first international Red Cross relief mission to the killing fields in the Armenian provinces of eastern Turkey in 1896. A year later, I sailed to Constantinople. After long negotiations with Sultan Abdul Hamid II, I opened the first American International Red Cross headquarters in the heart of Turkey. I traveled with 5 other Red Cross expeditions to the Armenian provinces in the spring of 1896, providing relief and humanitarian aid. People were starving. They were sick with typhoid, typhus, diphtheria, and smallpox, and thousands were dying. I had to do something, and the American Red Cross and other organizations helped save many lives.
I am Moses Dirk Halustian. I led an Armenian revolt against the Ottoman government. The Ottoman government had ordered the Turkish citizens of Musada region to expel the people in 6 Armenian villages in that area. Ottoman Turkish forces converged upon the town. The Armenians, aware of the impending danger, retreated to Musa Mountain. There were nearly 250 of us fighters, and we held off the Turkish soldiers and their supporters for 53 days. It was like the Jews' defense of Masada against the Romans in 73 CE, or the 30-day uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 during the Holocaust. But in those 2 revolts, the Jews died. Allied warships in the Mediterranean sighted us just as we were running out of ammunition and food. French and British ships evacuated 4,200 men, women, and children from Musada to safety in Egypt. Nearly all the men joined the French Armenian Legion, a military unit that went to fight against the Ottomans. Some of the survivors eventually settled in the town of Anjar in Lebanon. Today, Anjar is divided into 6 districts. Each district commemorates one of the villages of Musada. I'm immortalized in a monument in Beirut that's dedicated to the heroic fires of Musada.
In every genocide, there are people who reach out across the hate and violence to those who could be labeled the enemy. There are many stories of brave Turks who saved their Armenian friends and neighbors. These are the stories that give us hope, that inspire us, and that make us believe in a future of peace. Anahit Partitspanyan tells her family story of Turks and Armenians.
My grandmother was only 14 during the genocide. Their Turkish neighbors saved her and her family. If it hadn't been for those courageous Turks, I wouldn't be here today. During the deportations in my grandma's village, Armenians were gathered together and locked up. The local Turk neighbors saw the Armenians being captured and realized that none of them would survive. These Turks helped my grandmother and her family and the entire group to escape. Grandmother told me that they all had very good relations with their Turkish neighbors. They lived side by side and treated each other very warmly. Grandmother survived and moved to the US, but she always spoke of her never-ending longing for her home.
My name is Salal Bey. I'm a Turk. I was the governor of 2 provinces in the Ottoman Empire. At my first post in the province of Aleppo, I saw the Armenian deportations. I knew that the men, women, and children were being sent on government trains to their deaths at one of the extermination camps. I pleaded with my supervisors, asking them not to kill these innocent people. I told them there was no justification for the deportations and no reason to kill the Armenians. They told me that the Armenians were going to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and they had to be destroyed. I knew that wasn't true, and I told them so. Because of what I did, I was removed from my post as the governor of Aleppo, and I was transferred to the province of Konya. Konya was a major hub for deportation routes to the extermination camps. I received order after order from Istanbul to deport the Armenians to Konya, to send them to their deaths. I ignored each order. I was again removed from my post, but I'd already saved thousands of Armenian lives.
My name is Henry Morgenthau Sr. I was the United States ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and the most prominent American to speak out against the Armenian genocide. Early in my ambassadorship, I was concerned with the safety of American citizens in the Ottoman Empire, mostly Christian missionaries and Jews. But the one issue that truly preoccupied me was the Armenian question. I received reports nearly every hour with details about the massacres and deportation marches taking place in the Ottoman Empire. American consuls in different parts of the empire were documenting the massacres and deportation marches that were taking place. I informed the U.S. government about these atrocities and asked them to intervene. I spoke out in the United States. I wrote articles. I called on people to act, to do something to save the lives of innocent Armenians. I formed a public fund that raised today's equivalent of $1 billion to assist the Armenians. I worked with my friend Adolph Oakes, publisher of the New York Times, to get coverage of the massacres, and he ran 145 articles in 1915 alone. I met with Talat Pasha, one of the people responsible for the atrocities committed against the Armenians. He asked me, "Why are you so interested in the Armenians anyway? You're a Jew. These people are Christians." I replied to him, "You don't seem to realize that I am not here as a Jew, but as the American ambassador. I do not appeal to you in the name of any race or religion, but merely as a human being." I resigned from the ambassadorship in 1916. I had come to see Turkey as a place of horror. I had reached the end of my resources. I found intolerable a further daily association with men, however gracious and accommodating, who were reeking with the blood of nearly 1 million human beings. The State Department did not want me to tell the truth, and after I returned to the United States, I never got another diplomatic assignment. But I inspired my son, Henry, to do what is right. Henry became President Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury.
My name is Henry Morgenthau Jr. I was the only Jew in President Roosevelt's cabinet. In the late 1930s, I urged Roosevelt to open the United States' immigration quota to accommodate more immigrants fleeing the Nazi threat in Europe. Roosevelt would not agree with my proposal, but I wouldn't take no for an answer. I presented plan after plan trying to assist the Jews in Europe. Finally, in 1944, President Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board, which saved nearly 200,000 Jews from Nazi-occupied countries. The legacy of our family's activism lives on with my son, Robert Morgenthau, who served for 35 years as the district attorney for Manhattan.
My name is Era Jaretsian. I am an Armenian, and I escaped the genocide by fleeing with my family to Hungary. In the early 1930s, as the Nazis came to power and began targeting Jews, I joined the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian Nationalist Societal Party. It was a virulent anti-Semitic organization, ultimately responsible for the murders of thousands and thousands of Jews. While I was with the Arrow Cross, I used my position to help as many Jews as I could. I ran the clinic where I provided free medical treatment for civilians and soldiers. I supplied 40 Jewish doctors with fake documents so that they could work at the clinic and live in safety with their families. Although the Hungarian government knew I was hiding Jews in the clinic, they considered my work of treating Hungarian civilians and soldiers for free to be such an act of patriotism that they didn't investigate me. I eventually left the Arrow Cross because I didn't agree with their violence toward Jews. I paid for all the clinic costs out of my own pocket. I sheltered many Jewish doctors and protected 400 Jews. I am honored today in the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum of Jerusalem, a righteous among the nations for saving Jews. There are 26,685 people around the world who have received this recognition. 26 of us are Armenians.
My name is Taner Akşam. I was born and raised in Turkey. When I was a student, I learned about the Turkish government's vicious treatment of the Kurdish minority, and I spoke out for the rights of minority in Turkey. In 1976, I was sentenced to 10 years in prison for writing about Turkey's persecution of the Kurds. I was 22 years old. I used the leg of an iron stove and tunneled my way out of prison. Amnesty International adopted me as one of their first prisoners of conscience. I fled to Germany for political asylum. I went to graduate school and wrote about my dissertation on the genocide of the Armenians. I write books and give talks all over the world about the Armenian genocide. The Turkish government calls me a terrorist, and my life is in danger. In 2011, I won a judgment in the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled that the Turkish laws used to harass me for writing about the truth were violations of the freedom of expression. In 2007, my journalist friend Hrant Dink was assassinated for speaking about the truth of the Armenian genocide. I want the Turkish government to confront this dark chapter of its history. I want the people of Turkey to consider the suffering of all who lost their lives in the Armenian genocide.
My name is Pran Tashian. I am Armenian. My first husband, my 2 children, and nearly all of my relatives were killed in the Armenian genocide. I married Grigory, my second husband, after World War I, and we moved to Simferopol in the Soviet Crimea. One of my neighbors was a young Jewish woman, Evgenia. When World War II broke out, she and her children were at great risk from the Germans. I offered to shelter the children, and I hid them for over 2 years. My own children, Tigran and Asmik, helped keep lookout and warned us when the Germans were near. When Tigran and Asmik sounded the alarm, the Jewish children would hide in the cellar, in the attic, or even in the dog's kennel. After the end of the war, we stayed in touch with Evgenia's family. Our whole family was together when we were honored at Yad Vashem for saving Jews.
My name is Yervant Berkcan. My wife Elbis and I were living in Paris when the Nazis began rounding up Jews in 1941. The Nazis forced Jewish business owners to give up their shops and their livelihoods, just like they did in Germany. We saw this happen right in our own neighborhood. Joseph and Helene Goldhammer, Polish Jews who lived near us, were forced to give up their business. We knew that they were in terrible danger. I invited them to move in with us, and they shared our modest apartment for 8 months. We could have been killed for harboring Jews. The Goldhammers were very frightened for us. Eventually, they were able to move on to another safe place, sparing us from further danger. The Goldhammers survived the war and remained our close friends. It was our honor to be part of their lives.
These are the stories of brave people. Diplomats, a humanitarian, a writer, a physician, and ordinary people. They did the extraordinary because it was the right thing to do. We all can become upstanders. We can take small steps every day to make a difference in our families, our communities, and in the world. There are upstanders on every continent and at every time. We may not know each other or see each other, but we are never alone. Genocide is not a natural disaster. It's not a tsunami or a hurricane or an earthquake. It is man-made, and it can be prevented.
How can you become upstanders? There are 3 things you can do. First, contact your city government, your schools, your places of worship, and local organizations. Get them on board with these critical issues. Second, hold an event to educate others. Third, and most important, contact your elected officials. Ask them to support policies and laws to protect innocent people, prevent discrimination, hate, and conflict, prosecute those who perpetrate these crimes, and to remember those whose lives and cultures have been affected. Genocides continue to happen because we don't have the political will to stop them. We can create that will to leave the legacy of a world without genocide. Anne Frank said, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world."
Thank you.
Well, before you leave, just 1 or 2 other things. One is I just wanted to mention the Armenian genocide, the 100th anniversary celebration will be April 24th, 2015 at the St. Sahag Armenian Church in St. Paul. So Father, if you just want to stand up for one moment. So they are leading an Armenian anniversary next Friday, correct? Next Friday. So sort of continuing on our event, they will have their event. If anybody is interested, please attend their event for the Armenian observation over there. So I just wanted to thank everyone who's come here. We have really reached out to a lot of organizations to ensure that we start a dialogue about what the past has happened and what is happening now and what we could learn from. As we've learned, genocides have occurred and we've forgotten all about them and we've forgotten about the people. And we don't want to forget about the people. And we want to know what injustices we should be looking at now so that it doesn't happen in the future. So again, I just want to thank all of you for coming, and I hope that this event has made an impact on your lives and that you take this information and start a dialogue with somebody else. So thank you very much for coming.